Oh my god, it's daytime. Better not wear my sunglasses. So I was just rewatching this video that my buddy Tom Oliver made called Aesthetic Hegemony in Western Animation, in which he basically breaks down using a graphic from the Understanding Comics book in order to explain why it is that people perceive this modern style of cartoons popular in the 2010s, the so-called Cal Arts style, as being so similar. Why people perceive these shows as all looking the same, in spite of the fact that, as was pointed out in a tweet that he made this video in response to, there were tons of 80s cartoons that looked exactly the same, had total same face, because they were all going for hyper-realism. And while there is way more variety in the abstraction on display in those, you know, again, people call it Cal Arts. It's not like these literally come from Cal Arts, but, you know, it's just that people who made lots of really influential shows who went to Cal Arts you know, are part of what popularized this style, but whatever. I'm just calling it that for shorthand because it's the easiest way to let you know what I'm referring to. But this supposed style, in spite of how much variety it allows for, it's all contained within a very small portion of, like, the possibility of what could be done in abstracting the human face. And so there's still a sense of sameness that's not that different from the other picture, even though the obvious cherry-picked examples create the sensation that one side is more hegemonous. But the funny thing about it is that you could make a way better argument for modern Western cartoons. You can make a better argument for both eras because of the fact that there have always been cartoons that fill out all aspects of this plane. Yes, in the 80s there was a bunch of shit that looks the same. Yes, in the 2010s there was a bunch of shit that looks the same. But that realistic style from the 80s was also carried over in a lot of the DC and Marvel stuff that's gotten made that has been very well liked for having great character designs. There was abstract stuff in the 80s, obviously. So, you know, comparing these two sheets, it's like, okay, well, how about we put up one where we're comparing just like Care Bears from either era, I guess. You know, those are not even similar to the same style of designs of what is going on in these shows. So, you know, through any era, there's always been plenty of variety. There's always been trends. There's always been just whatever is popular in that moment, and people will gravitate towards it because that's the style. In the 80s, they were trying to sell action figures because kids bought toys, you know, and so, or parents bought toys for kids rather. So you would focus on having as many characters as possible that could be built from pretty similar molds that would, you know, just basically be interchangeable soldiers with different clothes or dolls or something. And so it makes sense for them to all look very similar and to, you know, to function cohesively as a toy set. But when you get into the modern era, kids don't play with toys, they play with phones, they play app games. They want things that will look good on a handheld device, characters that are very simplistic. You know, you don't want to go crazy in depth with your realism when you're looking at it on this tiny screen, and when it's got to be as immediate and poppy and appealing as possible because it's competing with all this shit from all this different media. I think right now, most of the appeal of the gritty, more realistic cartoons has moved to video games. People who were into G.I. Joe would be into Call of Duty now because it's way more, you know, realistic and aesthetically detailed. I mean, if you're going for realism, obviously you want the hyper-realistic graphics over a shitty old cartoon. But, not that G.I. Joe is shitty, but, you know, aesthetically to a young person, I can't imagine a Zoomer, you know, looking at G.I. Joe and then telling me it looks quote-unquote as good as the latest Call of Duty game, you know? So, then you've got the modern Cal Arts shows, and these, you know, these ones are like meant to be keychains. They're meant to be pop vinyl figures. They're meant to be just endless, tiny merchandise is pieces of candy. They're meant to be on ties or just on random pieces of apparel, outfitting an entire FYE, you know, like that is what the modern aesthetic is about. Simplicity, rounded edges. And I think that the reason that CalArts draws so much ire is clearly not that there is too much of the same, because then the 80s stuff would be drawing that same ire as well. It's more that people are reacting to specifically what this style represents to them. And I think one part of it is this sort of babyfication of culture. Even though, you know, those G.I. Joe cartoons were not like particularly you know, deep intellectually or anything, and they weren't even that violent. Characters didn't actually die in G.I. Joe, even though they might die in Adventure Time, you know. So it wasn't as dark, really, in a more intellectual sense. But, you know, those older shows, they were more just like kind of rough looking, and there was sort of an expectation that you know, even as a kid, could look at something that looked more adult. You know, the story is meant to be like understandable and appealing to you as a child, but you are connecting with adult characters who are meant to be aspirational, who, you know, you basically look up to as heroic figures. And we still have superheroes, obviously, who fill this role, and I think that's why superheroes are still presented more realistically, at least in, you know, the like the DC films and stuff like that, or like more serious DCU shit, even though there's plenty of babyfied versions of these heroes running around on TV as well. And these are just the ultra safe, accessible, and immediate appealing things. They're like sugar, they're like candy. You see it, you want it, you immediately eat it, and some of it turns out to have more flavor than what it might look like. And I think that's why there are so many people who defend these shows, because a lot of them are good. If you watch Adventure Time, Gravity Falls, if you watch Steven Universe, you know, these are shows that have good stories, good characters, interesting themes. They're not perfect, you know, they're not they're still beholden to a lot of the problems that just come from being kids shows, but you know, they're much better than most kids shows. And so I think it's fair to be a fan of these shows, to consider them good, and to want to defend this art style. But you also have to look at it from the perspective of somebody who is just not drawn to that aesthetic the way you are, who sees that simplification and wishes that if we're going to have a good story and good characters, that we did it in a way that was presented more realistically, that these weren't kids shows, you know, like some of us just don't want to watch that type of show. And when we see that there are, you know, like tons of adults who are constantly talking about these cartoons and sort of proliferating them, we might think, man, wouldn't it be nice if like a type of show that we really want to be proliferated was instead, you know, just the people who aren't into this particular aesthetic. But again, there is plenty of divergence in Western animation these days. I mean, I think of a show like BoJack Horseman, or like anything that's ever been done by Adult Swim, and like this stuff is aesthetically nothing like what we get on Cartoon Network. It's all over the place. There have been plenty of genres, and obviously not as many as I would like. Western cartoons tend to be way over focused on comedy. You rarely get Western cartoons with no element of comedy unless they're a superhero thing that is usually very plot driven and serious. But you know, as an anime fan, the biggest appeal of anime to me is the breadth of genre covered. Obviously that's been threatened in recent years because anime, just like Western cartoons, has its trends, and there's 4 new isekai shows to 4 to 6 every fucking season for the last couple years. But it's, you know, it still has way more variety, and that makes it more appealing to me. So, you know, I look at the CalArts trend, the so-called CalArts trend, and yeah, it is somewhat repellent to me, not because I even dislike these shows. As I said, I like a bunch of them. I'm just like tired of the exact same tone. All of these shows are inspired by one another. All of them try to be very similar. And there's a sort of spectrum of wacky humor to like dark sincerity in its undertone, but all the shows exist somewhere on that spectrum. And you know, again, as an anime fan, I just watched a show about a like detective jewel appraiser, like full of pretty boys. I mean, it wasn't even that good, but it was something that I would never get out of a Western show, and was one of 50 things that I watched this season that all had totally different concepts and plots, except for the 4 isekais that were in there probably. But I don't even think there were that many isekais this season. This is a good season for anime. Anyway, if you want to hear me talk about the current season of anime, head over to the Content channel, because that's where I'm talking about seasonal shows right now. And if you want more Western animation stuff, I mean, I guess I've done some of those before. Tom Oliver also has some. If you want to subscribe to his channel, links to that on screen. See you in the next one.